We have a spark plug gap in our engine of 30 thousandths. The question I'm posing here is just how long the spark will be. Now the answer is not quite as clear as you might think, although it will become obvious by the time we get to the end of this video. What we're doing here is a continuation of our quest to find out the validity of the existence or not of the 100 mile per gallon carburetor. What I'm attempting to demonstrate here is that the so-called 100 mile per gallon carburetor is in many respects totally existent on what it's installed on. We've already looked at things like compression ratio and things like that and seen just how dramatically it can alter the performance achieved with any carburetor. So let's move on. Our last step was Swirl. Basically, we looked at Swirl and determined that mixture motion was a good idea. Here's what mixture motion looks like in reality. This type of port and chamber generated swirl, as on a Chevy and anything that looks like it, will typically generate about 2,200 RPM on a paddle type swirl meter. This is good. You'll notice how it sweeps across the spark plug area. That helps spread or lengthen the spark that the charge sees and consequently fires it up easier. What we're doing here is a continuation of our quest to find out the validity of the existence or not of the 100 mile per gallon carburetor. What I'm attempting to demonstrate here is that the so-called 100 mile per gallon carburetor is in many respects totally existent on what it's installed on. We've already looked at things like compression ratio and things like that and seen just how dramatically it can alter the performance achieved with any carburetor. So let's move on. Our last step was Swirl. Basically, we looked at Swirl and determined that mixture motion was a good idea. So essentially what we are doing is honing in on what type of vehicle will get or will allow us to put on an efficient carburetor and get that 100 mile per gallon. Remember, it's all about how much power we draw from the engine as well as how well the carburetor may work. So let's look at the spark. Why do we need a spark? It's to light up the mixture. Now you would think so long as it lights, that's just good enough. No, you can have a poor combustion process as opposed to a well-functioning process. Now, short term, the bigger and more energetic the spark is, the better our combustion process will be. Where's the limits? What dictates what? Well, let's look at that. First off, voltage. We need a certain amount of voltage to jump a certain length of gap. Now, once that gap has been broken down or ionized, the voltage delivered to the spark plug does not go up anymore. The voltage goes up and up and up and up until the spark breaks, the voltage breaks down the gap and it fires. So if that spark is hot enough, it should have done the job. Not quite. What we have here is 3 examples of the kind of spark that you could have in your engine. Far left is a stock HEI, known for its ability to fire mixtures very well, especially at low RPM. Fades at high RPM, but does the job for a mileage motor mostly. Now you will notice how the spark is not emanating from the end of the side electrode, and it's not firing from the middle of the center electrode. It's going from the corner. I want you to note that because I'm going to bring that subject up in a moment. Next one is an MSD6. Quite a bit bigger spark. The last one is a super hopped up system involving an MSD11. The parts on it are such that it generates such a high voltage that it could be dangerous if the car has a crash and the system is still live. So we've never used something exactly like that in practice. But notice how big the fireball is from the spark. Huge. Now, let's take the center case here for the MSD6. When we blow swirl motion through that spark, the spark turns into like a U shape emanating from each electrode, and the spark length can be as much as 3/8 of an inch. Now, which is going to light the best? The little spark we've got on the left, which sure it'll get longer when it gets blown through, but it won't match the spark in the middle. Essentially, we find, though it's in decreasing amounts of return, we find that the more energy we put into the spark, the better result we can get. But it's not just a question of putting it in. There's a lot more to it. If we just test the spark out in the open in a fixed gap, we will find that the spark is only as long as the gap, as you see in this picture here. So that might actually limit the energy that goes into the gap. So let's make the gap bigger. Well, now it takes more energy to fire it. Yes, but it produces a bigger spark, which means it starts a flame front over a longer length of spark. Make the gap bigger and it keeps on going. Now, if you have a cylinder in which the mixture motion is low, you would think that the spark will just light what's adjacent to it and then it will creep slowly over the chamber. No, it doesn't work quite like that. Even if you've got rapid mixture motion, the burn through the mixture, actually going through the mixture, i.e. the airspeed, is not significantly different in a high swirl chamber as it is in a low swirl chamber. You can say, yes, but it's going to meet the flame front. No, the flame front is advancing through the charge, irrespective of its motion, at a relatively fixed speed for that phase of the combustion process. So what we have here is the spark is controlled by the swirl. In other words, if we have good swirl, we can start off with a plug gap which is not too difficult to fire, say 30-40 thousandths, and it will bridge that gap in a fairly straight line. But if we have a high swirl, what happens is as the spark fires, it will stretch the spark out. Now, this is what I said, how long will a spark be? If we have a cylinder which has high swirl, it will swirl and blow that spark off to one side. That will create a long spark length over which the fuel air mixture can be ignited. What will happen is the flame front will progress faster at the start of the burn. So this means we can use less ignition advance so that the pressure, more of the pressure rise occurs when the piston's being pushed down rather than when it's still going up. Now, that doesn't make as much difference as you might think, because whatever force you take to compress the charge, if there was no friction involved, you get back as well as what's generated by the heat. Almost works out that way, but not quite. So what we need then is a spark which has as much energy as possible and produces a combustion ignition property due to its length. So we've got that to take into account. Now, what can we do to improve this? Will a long spark work better than a short spark? Will a high temperature spark, very short, work better than a lower temperature spark lasting much longer? Do we need multiple sparks, etc., etc.? Well, good question. It would appear, in my experience, that once we've lit the charge as effectively as possible, that anything more has little effect on the combustion. Now, I'm talking about now a normal spark ignition system, spark plug, wire, etc., etc. Now, this leads me to the question, does an MSD with its multiple sparks work better than a single spark? Well, yes, but not in terms of outright power. It works better at low RPM, where the swirl is minimal, and it works better at idle, where the first spark may not be particularly generous and whatever. You know, any mixture motion agitation is not really doing a great job. Quench works very well at low RPM. Now, what do we do about that? Well, the first thing we do is we make sure that the swirl in the cylinder is as good as we can get it. And we're back to that deal whereby we looked at this, and I'll put the episode that it was down here or over here, wherever, and you can see that the combustion process due to the spark is very important. We need to get that flame front started as late as possible in the compression cycle, i.e. not needing too much advance, and get it going pretty much as fast as we can. Now, I say pretty much as fast. You can have an engine that is mechanically noisy if the pressure rise is too fast. So long as we don't run into that situation to any extent, we want that burn to take place as quick as possible whilst the charge is as compact as possible. Therefore, the burning takes place and we get the highest expansion ratio from any given small volume of charge. So we get the maximum push on the piston for the fuel that we're burning. So, can you have an ignition too powerful? No. Do you need to worry about one that's too powerful in any way? A minor thing, it might eat up plugs quicker, but we can always get a good set of plugs. How important is the plug form? It's very important. I've shown how to shape the end of a spark plug to get the best results short of re-engineering the whole plug. The position of the plug electrodes can also influence how well the charge is lighted off. I'm sure that's the right way to say it, light it off. We'll go for it. Anyway, here's an example in a big block Chevrolet. A regular tip spark plug versus an extended tip spark plug. Now, be warned that the regular tip spark plug can control the temperature of the electrodes easier than an extended one. So if you go to an extended nose spark plug, it's a good idea to go a grade colder so that we keep that tip electrode temperature in control. How much power is it worth? On a typical big block, replacing the spark plugs with a set of extended nose spark plugs and dressing the plug in the manner I'm just about to show can equal an easy 8 to 10 horsepower and a better brake specific fuel consumption at part throttle. Whoopee, that's exactly what we want. However, you don't just replace the spark plugs. You're going to have to go in there and tweak the timing. Now, if you're interested in just power, then the drag strip's a place to do that. You know, not just 1 or 2 runs, but get a good base run and then tweak that ignition. Usually an extended nose spark plug requires 1 or 2 degrees less advance. Usually. How many motors does this work on? Well, not everyone, just almost everyone. Let me give you a few examples on which it works well. Big block Chevrolet, small block Chevrolet, any model of small block Chevrolet, virtually all small block Fords, especially a small block Ford, because they have terrible swirl because the port comes in at the wrong angle. A-series mini engine works great on that because it has a great combustion chamber, but it's very sensitive to where it's lit off. And I mean, there's dozens of engines, but I've just told you the ones that I've seen that work best. Now let's go on to spark plug form. What I'm showing here is a regular spark plug tip versus how I do mine, and it works. Before I showed you, earlier on, I showed you that the spark usually doesn't emanate from the tip of the side electrode, but it does almost always emanate under high pressure conditions, which is how we tested this, at the corner of the center electrode. Not always, the spark does tend to dance around. However, we can do away with the overhang on the side electrode. Sparks almost always emanate from a corner, and it takes less to fire them because that corner tends to be at higher temperature. And a sharp edge and a higher temperature is conducive to easier firing. Also, it puts the spark in a more open space. Also, it's easier to fire, so if you want more energy, you can get away with opening the spark gap by at least 5 thousandths for better combustion. Now, let's look at the ultimate spark plug as far as I am aware. This is one that I and my friend, who's a top-notch university professor in Germany, and this is a plug we developed over about 4 months in under combustion conditions, i.e. high pressure chambers, nitrogen oxygen ratio is right, and we found that this plug gave not only the best spark but also on the dyno the best results. We did this probably, it's got to be almost 30 years ago, maybe more. And unfortunately we couldn't patent it because, can you believe this? One of my, how shall I say, fans, a very reputable engine builder who just won 2 championships with a Formula 2000 single-seaters that uses the 2-litre Pinto engine. His engine was basically running away from everybody else's, and he said one of the tweaks that he did was to drill a hole in the middle of the electrode and drill a dimple in it, and I saw my patent and millions of dollars disappear. However, there is an alternative you can use. It's this plug here, quick as an X3. Anyway, I'll show a picture of it. Here it is. You'll recognize the packaging in the store from the pretty colorful, I'm just looking over at my screen now, the pretty colorful green and black decor on it. Now, the point here though is the shape around the center electrode on what I guess you call the side electrode, even though it's got 3 feet that it sits on the plug body. Now, this has a very similar spark characteristics as the plug that I and my professor partner designed. So it's a good plug. Now, I haven't tried any of their race plugs. My one concern when I tried when they first came out, tried one of their regular street plugs, was that yes, after a lot of fiddling around, I did get better results. Now, both setups were fiddled around with extensively. In other words, the before one was fiddled around until we could not see 1/10 of a horsepower more on average. I'm exaggerating there, but you know what I mean. And then we changed plugs, and we probably did, I don't know, another 30 pulls to see if we could get better results. And we did. It took slightly less timing, and something else we did as well. I think we put in a jet or an air corrector to lean out the mixture slightly. And after we'd done that, we put the old plugs back in, or the original plugs, dynoed it, and then went back to the spec we had before, and the results repeated. None of this quick, 2 pulls, and oh yeah, it makes more horsepower. No, that's not how we do things here, right? To test those plugs, we probably did, all told, somewhere around about 60 pulls. 60 pulls, right? So the result on our small block Chevy was not one that was just, it showed more horsepower. It was very thoroughly done. We took averages, the result distribution was small, we got the engine to repeat very well, and that 3 horsepower was about it. So did we get any power just by swapping them? Well, maybe just a tad, but now I'm talking about differences that are within experimental error. It looked like we picked up, on an average of about 10 runs each way, we picked up somewhere like about 1 horsepower mean over the RPM range we tested. So we know it works at least as good as whatever plug we had to start with, which was in itself was a plug that we ran top-notch figures on. So there you have it. As a quick reminder here, that plug with the strange top on it, I can't quite remember it, but when I'm editing, I'll put a shot in. Do they give you better mileage? Yes, they do. Especially when you have a high swirl chamber, because then you get a really big flame front started. But usually, to get the best results, you need a good strong ignition, and you need to retard the ignition slightly at any given point in the cycle. Now, we've got to the point now where we've looked at a lot of factors for this 100 mile per gallon carburetor, but are we there yet? No. And let me just remind you of one thing here. We are not looking at 100 miles per gallon from some teeny weeny little car with a moped a thing on it. I expect this car to do 0 to 60 at most in 10 seconds, carrying at least 2 passengers and their luggage, and have 4 seats available. So it's got to be a real car with real 4-seat capability. Top speed, not so much worried about that. So long as it will top 90 miles an hour, I think we'll be good. Really, if we think about it, we should be driving anywhere where there's a speed limit at more than 90 miles an hour. So there you have it. What we need there is a spark plug with a capability of a long spark due to swirl. As far as plug temperature ratings go, if we have a very high voltage available to start with, we can use a spark plug range, which is a heat range cooler than maybe would otherwise be the case. Maybe even 2 heat ranges cooler, so that we step well away from detonation. So here's the deal for your ignition system, and it may seem out of place. High swirl, high voltage, high amperage spark, or a box that will deliver that. Accurate spark timing for the mixture conditions at the throttle opening and RPM that we're dealing with, and the ability to fire that spark come what may as far as the ignition is concerned. None of these weak, puny sparks like you used to get in the old coil ignition and points deal, where a bit of oil on the plug and you're shot. Now, when MSD first came out with their big boxes, you could dip that plug into oil, connect it up, boom, and it'd fire right through it. That's the kind of ignition we want. But when you've got that type of ignition, your timing becomes more and more important. Now, I don't mean what you set the distributor out there, the timing at the RPM and the engine vacuum concerned. And it's not just a simple thing. We'll have to talk about ignition timing and finding the right curve in that in another video. Anyway, that's it for today. We are going to go on with our 100 mile per gallon carburetor stuff, hopefully in a little more speedy way, as we've still only got the sparks. We really haven't talked about the carburetor itself, but trust me, that will be coming. Now, there is one more plug I wanted to talk about here, which is, and I've forgotten the name of it, but I'm going to do a video just on this spark plug to see what characteristics it has. It's different from pretty much all the other plugs as far as I know, in as much as the center electrode, as it travels down through the plug, has got an air gap in the middle of the plug. Right, so it has to come down, fire over this air gap, which is about 1/8 of an inch, and then fire the plug electrode gap. Now, you might think, why would you want to do that? That's what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to look at the effectiveness of that under very controlled conditions. So look for a video on that plug down the road. That's all for now. I will see you in the next video, and don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to like. If you've done all those things, then now we can sign off. See you in the next video. Thank you for watching.